Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Redberryweo here, and welcome back to another quick Civil Air Patrol video. In today's video, we are talking about Chapter 11 of Learn to Lead. I am determined to eventually get through all the Learn to Lead chapters and create nice summaries for them. I do apologize that it has taken me a number of years to actually do this, but we're getting to it. And I know that also with some of the higher achievements, people don't, not as many people get as far in the program. Hopefully this will help with more people getting further in the program, but there are more people doing Achievement 1 than there are doing Achievement 11 in Civil Air Patrol. So you can understand where I've been trying to focus some of those energies. Anyway, so I am doing Chapter 11 today. This includes a couple of different mnemonics. This includes a couple of different anecdotes and fun things. This chapter talks about the leader as a commander. And so if you have not previously watched my other Learn to Lead videos and you're like, Chapter 11, I'm on Chapter 3. There is a Chapter 3 video. I haven't made any videos yet and posted them yet after Chapter 11, but hopefully I will be doing that by the end of the year. So, not a promise, but I'm going to try. But today's video is going to be Chapter 11, the leader as commander. The chapter starts out by talking about when you accept command, that there are a couple of different things that you should do. One of the first things is stay away from the position until you actually assume command. The military does this pretty easily because they're physically moving people, or at least the US military physically moves the officers from base to base. So you really can't assume command until you've actually been moved and your duty station is at the new place. But within a Civil Air Patrol unit, it's a little bit different because you've grown in that unit and you haven't actually stepped into the role of cadet commander until the change of command takes place. The next tip that it talks about is making a break from your old job. And again, with the US military, that's fairly easy to do. Or even with just a normal job in general. It's fairly easy to make a break. You work on transitions, you write continuity documentation, and then you just move on to the next role. But within Civil Air Patrol, especially as a cadet, that can be a little bit more challenging because you have visibility of that old role that you were in, and you're still actively involved in the same unit in theory. Most people don't bounce between different units on a frequent basis unless they are in a military family, in which case they might transfer a couple of times. But a lot of times it can be very tricky to make a clean break between your old job and the new job that you are going to be taking on. But then that next thing that it also talks about in the book is prepare to take on new responsibilities as you step into the role of commander. And something that I do want to talk about a little bit with this is a lot of commanders, they previously serve in a higher level leadership role. So with my unit, the current cadet commander was previously the deputy cadet commander. And the application was open to everyone, but the person that was selected for the role of cadet commander was previously the deputy cadet commander. So the responsibilities of the deputy commander, or the deputy commander for support or operations, is going to be different than what the overall cadet commander does in a unit. Same thing goes for a unit commander versus the CDC or the CDS, which are the deputy commanders for seniors and for cadets. They all have different responsibilities. At the end of the day, the commander is responsible for everything that happens in the unit and making sure that we're actually accomplishing what we need to be doing. But then that's delegated down through the deputies and through the chains, right? And so this chapter really tries to emphasize that there are different leadership techniques throughout your term as a commander, and that you need to learn what those new responsibilities are in association with your new job. And so then it goes into, what do the first 90 days as a commander look like? So in order to remember the first 90 days after becoming a commander, I came up with a little mnemonic when I was preparing for spots. Use this if you'd like, but it is position the mission experts to know people's health and fit direction. Yes. So position refers to you're brand new to the position. You need to learn the responsibilities associated with it. You need to learn what your role is in general. And you also need to learn what your boss's expectations are. Unless you're like the head honcho of the entire organization, you're likely still going to have a boss, but you might be a boss yourself as a commander. So like as an example, the cadet commander is a commander, but they also have a boss, and that would be the CDC or the deputy commander for cadets. And so understanding what the boss's expectations are very important. In terms of the mission portion, it's being proficient in the knowledge associated with that mission in addition to technical expertise. For example, if you are an IT manager and you don't have any IT experience, that can be very challenging to manage people who are in IT. If you are a game developer and you are a producer, which is someone who typically manages those teams, if you don't understand the development pipeline of like, how do we integrate the art in? How do we add the programming in? How do we take design components, add that in? Where does the writing go? That makes your job fairly challenging. And so understanding the ins and outs of your industry, and this can also relate to Civil Air Patrol, but like just in general, it's good to understand what the job is, what you are trying to accomplish, and working towards achieving that by having experience as you come into the role as commander. Next one is knowing your people, and knowing your people is fairly important. People are there to get the job done, but they are more than just that. And a challenge that I've seen a lot of cadet leaders fall into is that they only really care about the mission getting done. Or they'll only talk and like direct people like, you need to do this, you need to do that. But they don't see like the full scope of the person that they are working with. And so it is important to understand what their goals are, what their experience is, tailoring tasks in association with what they're interested in, what they're most passionate about. And there are a lot of people out there that are more than happy to do jobs that they don't necessarily enjoy doing, but they can truly appreciate when a leader acknowledges what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and then put them into tasks that really align with what they're looking to do, in addition to expanding their current skill set. Next step is ascertaining the health of the unit. And this can vary. If you've already been in the unit, then you probably already have a general idea of what the health of the unit is like. Some units are really, really strong. Some units need a little bit of tender loving care. I have been in both extremes of like, the unit really needs a lot of help to get back into shape and make sure it even passes a subordinate unit inspection or an SUI. And there are some units that are like super stellar that have got a lot of involved members, both on the senior member and the cadet side. They have a ton of cadet sponsor members, and they've just got it together, and it's awesome. Both units exist, and both units deserve to be successful and have a lot of time and energy put into them. But as a commander, you need to be able to take a step back and look at what is the current situation. What are the resources that we have available to the unit? Like, that can include physical resources, like do we have color guard equipment? That could even be people, that could be time. Looking at where the unit's health is can help with you establishing what you're trying to accomplish during your term as commander. If you're in a unit that may not necessarily be meeting contact hours for cadets, CAP Regulation 60-1 outlines that we're required to do certain contact hours every month. Some units are successful with this, some are not. And if you are in a unit that has cadets, you're technically supposed to be meeting those requirements. And so as a commander, it's good to be generally aware of, like, especially if you are a cadet, which I assume if you're watching this, you are a cadet. Be familiar with CAP Regulation 60-1. You don't need to memorize it, but if you're going for spots, you will need to be familiar with it a little bit more in depth. And it has a lot of important information about, like, what is an encampment? And how do they define encampment? How is the testing done for each of the different achievements? It outlines the whole cadet program. So as a commander, or as a senior cadet in general, it's just good to be familiar with that information. So that's just kind of an aside, but keep that in mind when serving in the role. When you're looking at the health of the unit, one of those documents that is helpful in evaluating it as kind of like a little tool is using the 60-1 for when you're looking at the cadet side of things. Just saying. Next one is fit, which is how does your unit, how does your team fit into the larger organization? So if you are in a unit, like a squadron or a flight, looking how that fits into the group level or even the wing level, right? If you are in another organization, like if you're in a scouting unit, the scouting unit individually might do activities, but then there might be the overall organization that you might do regional activities with different groups. Who knows? And so understanding what role your unit plays in the overall organization can be very useful, especially when trying to accomplish stuff. Like, there are some units that have more emergency services oriented individuals. There are some units that have a lot of pilots, and it could be for a number of reasons, like the location of the airport is nearby, so the pilots join that unit. And what you might be able to do is, by knowing your unit's capabilities and knowing other units' capabilities, you'll be able to do inter-unit collaborations, like for cadet orientation rides, which is very important and should be done on a regular basis as funding is available. And you can also do just joint exercises to help train each other up and strengthen each other in the long term. The last step is direction, and that's looking at what direction do you actually want to take the unit. I always ask my cadet commanders, what is your legacy going to be when you are done being cadet commander? The term for cadet commander can vary in length, but no matter what, you are the lead cadet of the unit. You are the model of what all the other cadets in the unit are looking up to. And whether you have 4 cadets under your commandership, or 40, or 400, you are going to make a lasting impact, whether you know it or not. And so it's very important to think about, where do you want to go? Some people talk about SMART goals. We've talked about SMART goals before, and I've made even like a little focus video on SMART goals, which I'll link somewhere in the iCard. It may not appear immediately, but it'll be linked in the iCard. And it's important to be able to look at where are we currently and where are we going. What steps do you need to take as a commander to get there, and what steps do you need to empower your people in order to get there? Because as a commander, you can't do everything. You can't do everything. That's just impossible. You gotta delegate. You gotta work with your people. And so that's a really critical leadership lesson that some cadet officers have a challenge doing, that they want to be the doers. And when I see like a cadet officer doing something that like an NCO could have been empowered to do, I'll be like, hey, I think that's something that an NCO could have done. And they'll be like, yes, ma'am. And then they'll continue, and then they learn, though. They learn over time that like you're able to empower and delegate people who have less experience than you, because even though you know the correct answer, they may not know the correct answer, and you can kind of nudge them in the right direction so that they learn, and then that cycle of influencing persists over time. So there are 3 different challenges that the book discusses on just challenges as a commander in general. One of them is it can be hard to be yourself sometimes. Another is you're not really one of the guys anymore. And the other one is that you can be tempted by ego. And I've seen pitfalls both on the cadet side and the senior member side where commanders can run into those challenges. And I myself have also run into those challenges. And we're going to talk about each of those just a little bit. In terms of being yourself, you do not need to change who you are to be the commander. Now, it is true that when you're in different situations, you might act a little bit differently. Like when you're hanging out with your best friends, that isn't necessarily how you're going to hang out when you're just sitting in class, right? So there will be a difference in how you normally act. But if you are a more soft-spoken person, you shouldn't force yourself to be like screaming at people at unit meetings. That's not you. Stick to who you are. You have been selected for a commander position, whatever position you are in, for a reason, in theory, right? And if you've been selected for that position, continue to be who you are, challenging yourself, but also not changing who you are just so that you can like fit the mold that you think the role is. Some people say fake it till you make it. That is true. You like if you are not feeling overly enthusiastic about something and you kind of need to be more enthusiastic because attitudes are contagious, as we've discussed in like phase 1 of Learn to Lead books. Sometimes you will need to push yourself a little bit, but you're never going to like be a different person. Just be yourself, be comfortable in your role while also challenging yourself. To talk about the next one is you're not one of the guys anymore. I will say for this one, people also like to say that it's lonely at the top. Because, with the chain of command, you really shouldn't be like complaining down. You should really be complaining like at your level or like venting at your level or up. Because if there's like a command decision that you really disagree with, you should not be disclosing those with your followers. It's really not a good practice because that can distill some distrust across the followership. You want to do your best to maintain like strong cohesion across your command team. And so there have been instances, like when I was a cadet commander for an encampment, it was very challenging to feel like I was relatable and connecting with the cadets who were on my cadet staff. I had over 100 cadet staff members, and I felt bad that I couldn't really like personally connect with all of them all the time. And I did my best, and I had little meetings with each of the support teams and each of the operations teams so that I got some interaction with them and they felt like I had an open door policy. And I have talked about my experience a little bit with encampment before, but it's not really the same. It's not that really deep personal connection that you might have like as a flight commander to a flight sergeant. Or like having a cohort of different flight sergeants where you can like talk to each other. You could be like, oh my gosh, I had this one cadet, and oh yeah, I had this one cadet who wore their belt backwards and I don't even know how they put it on backwards. Like, you can always talk to people as a commander, but people will view you differently. They will interact with you differently as the commander of a unit versus being considered more of like a peer in the chain of command. So that's just something to keep in mind. It can get a little challenging, but if you are honest with your command team, if you talk to the people that you actively work with, like if you are a cadet commander, talking to your CDC, that's a good place to start if you're feeling a little lonely as commander. The CDC might feel a little lonely too. Who knows? And you can talk about that challenge and talk about how you can personally overcome not necessarily being part of like just the group anymore, and that you are taking on additional leadership challenges that people may not even be aware of. Yeah, pretty cool stuff. And then the third one, again, was ego. Don't be tempted by ego. And I have seen cadets and senior members struggle with this. It's completely normal, but sometimes the power gets to their head just a little bit. And there have been instances where I've seen like a senior member just like walk up and be like, I'm going to just take control of this because I had 30 years of experience in the military and I'm just going to take over this situation because I know what I need to do. Yes, they could in theory do that, and they could do it, but it may not necessarily be the correct course of action or the most appropriate course of action in order for other members to learn. And there are ways that you can empower people while also utilizing your experience. And so being tempted by ego is something that you may or may not have observed if you are already at chapter 11 in CAPS, Learn to Lead modules stuffs. But just keep in mind that it is a thing, and it's best to keep yourself in check. And also, if there are other cadets that could use a little nudge in the right direction, then keep an eye out for them. Be a good wingman. The next portion of the chapter talks about command intent, and that goes over DCC. And DCC stands for Developed, Communicated, and Cooperate. Developed essentially means that you are taking the command intent from the upper echelon, applying your own personal values in addition to your understanding, your philosophy, and what culture you would like to instill upon the unit, and you develop your own. You can also get input from other people as you are developing it, but the development process is integrating what you are familiar with and looking at the goals and the why of what you are doing in order to accomplish the mission at the end of the day. Then the next step is to communicate. Communicate, I mean, you can talk to people about it, you can send emails, you can write formal memorandums. It is any form of communication in which you would like to distribute your command intent. And whenever you are doing something, whenever you're taking actions, whenever you are just doing stuff in general, you are living your command intent, because the command intent is how you are accomplishing the mission as the commander and what you expect of your team. So if you are sending out emails on a regular basis and you have a specific tone in them, let's say for some reason you decided you wanted to do all caps, bolded, and highlighted in yellow, that is a way you can do it. And you are communicating a command intent of maybe a little bit more of an assertive form of written communication. It would also be very difficult to read. And then the third component of it is really cooperate, imagine, and intent, where you're allowing your followers to interpret what you put together in order to facilitate it with their own teams. So you got command intent passed down to you, and then you pass down the command intent to your subordinates, and the subordinates will interpret what you put together and do their best to facilitate the command intent in alignment with yours by establishing their own. So every organization really should have a mission, vision, and command intent. And in this chapter, the next thing we talk about is the mission. And the mission is what is actively being done with the unit now. And so if we look at Civil Air Patrol's mission statement, their mission/vision statement is volunteers serving America's communities, saving lives, and shaping futures. And so by looking at that statement, it helps us to understand what a mission statement is a little bit, and I'll go a little bit more in depth. A mission statement is supposed to inspire the team, and it's supposed to go into what is the organization actually doing? And it's supposed to provide a foundation to establish a positive organizational culture for it to just function. Next, we'll talk a little bit about human capital, which is how a human's skills, values, and knowledge are utilized by the commander. So something that's really important in general is, as a commander, your people need to know what the expectations are. And by having a job description is a document that summarizes the expectations that you have for said person in a duty position. And so in the job description, which is a clear, concise definition of what the roles and responsibilities are of a specific job, you should be able to say, why does the job even exist? How does that role interact with other jobs within the organization? There is the idea that in theory it could be done under joint authorship, which means that the person who is the commander sits down with the person who is taking on the job, and they go through the job description together, writing it together. In a lot of cases, though, in practice, that doesn't happen. Normally, the job description is outlined ahead of time, and then people say if they're interested or not. And in that job description, it's good to include what the actual functions are and any performance expectations associated with it. Like if a cadet staff member is joining staff and I want them to be responsive to emails, in the job description, I'm going to say, I expect you to respond within 48 to 72 hours to my emails. And if there is a time that you're not going to be available to do that, then the expectation is that you communicate with me in advance, saying that you will not be available for X time frame. And the reason why it's so important to be clear with your expectations is because if people don't know, then you can't be upset with them if they don't meet the expectation. Like if a cadet is supposed to be teaching one class per month and they don't know that they're doing that, that's not really fair to them. And honestly, it's a failure on the commander if it hasn't been communicated, because then the person isn't effectively getting their job done because of the lack of knowledge, lack of experience, and lack of expectations being set. So it's very important to make sure that the expectations, especially performance standards, are very clear in the job description. And if someone isn't following through with those expectations, then you can always go back to that document and talk them through it and say, hey, we need to talk through this. We're a team and we're going to talk about it. And just as a quick anecdote that highlights the importance of job descriptions, there was a time that we had, like, at encampment, I have a lot of encampment examples. At encampment, we had a squadron commander that just refused to do their job. Before all the cadet staff accepted their duty assignments and their duties, they understood what they were because we sent a job description associated with the position that they were accepting. And we said, okay, you're accepting this position. Do you agree to these expectations and these duties / responsibilities? If so, reply to this email accepting the position. And so that cadet did accept the position, but they were not meeting expectations in any way. Whenever we would pass down information to them, they didn't share it with their flight staff. They didn't share it with their first sergeant. It just kind of sat in their inbox. And there were times where there was stuff that we were passing down that needed to be responded to in a timely manner. And we were using the chain of command, as you should, to empower your people. But this person would just not check their email. They wouldn't respond to anything. They wouldn't put documentation together. It was very frustrating for us, and it was very frustrating for the people in their squadron. And so what happened was we sat down with them. We had a discussion. We looked at the job description and we said, okay, these were the expectations that we set. Do you feel like you've been meeting those expectations? And they said yes. And so we said, okay, well, in 2 weeks, we're going to revisit this and we would like you to do your best with maintaining these expectations. They did not. They didn't change anything. So over those 2 weeks, we kept track of how frequently were we sending stuff and not receiving anything back. How many times would we try calling them or texting them and they wouldn't get back to us? And we sat down with them 2 weeks later and we were like, okay, so your choices are to step down from the position, stay in the position and have an assistant, or stay in the position and you have a trial period. If you do not meet our expectations, then we will revert to the other two options. They chose to go with that third option of just retaining their position and just not changing anything. Nothing changed. They didn't improve their communications in any way. So we ended up having another follow-up discussion and saying, hey, nothing's changed. So we're going to options. Either you step down or we assign an assistant for you. And they ended up stepping down from the position. But the job description was critical to being able to maintain accountability of that individual in that position. Because if we didn't have that, then they could be like, well, I'm doing what I need to be doing, so it doesn't matter. And we could be like, what? That's not good. So that is a quick anecdote about the importance of job descriptions and that you really need to make sure that people understand what the expectations are. And if they don't, and it's clear that they don't, always have follow-up discussions with them, be transparent, and do your best to empower them as a team member. Next section of chapter 11 is talking about interviews. I know this chapter is kind of like all over the place. It talks about a lot of different concepts, so I'm probably going to have to break this off into 2 different videos. I'm going to try to fit this all into one. It's a lot of content, guys. So with interviews, you should really have a structured, standardized process when you are doing it. You can have open-ended questions. You can have scenario-based questions. You can have a dialogue back and forth. But the important thing is that you ask the same kind of standard set of questions, and then you also have a scorecard that has the same standard on it to be able to make sure that you are providing all candidates with equal opportunity for the position. And when I have talked about just generally selection processes, I don't personally prefer interviews. I prefer behavioral-based evidence. And yeah, you can ask scenario-based stuff, but there is a difference between seeing someone doing something and hearing them talk through the situation. Like when I did some cadet staff selections for a unit a couple of years ago, we didn't have the chance to do a nice in-person or even virtual cadet staff selection exercise where they would like receive a logic puzzle and we would look at communication skills, or we would ask them to teach something and then they would teach something. We didn't have the opportunity to do any of those things. So I was looking at different traits and different skills based on the interview stuff. And so as one of the grading criteria that we used, one of the things that I wanted people to be more focused on was safety awareness. And so we gave them 1 or 2 situations based off of safety concerns, like a frisbee being thrown on top of a building, and what they would do if they saw a group of cadets like jumping on each other's shoulders trying to get the frisbee off the roof. And like the first step, like grading criteria wise, was to say knock it off, because that is the phrase Civil Air Patrol wants people to use if they see something unsafe. And some people got it, some people didn't. But there's also like acknowledging that the situation is unsafe, talking about why it wasn't a safe situation, and providing recommendations to that group of people of what they could do moving forward instead of doing that unsafe behavior. So you can do different types of questions, but when you're asking them, they need to be consistent so that there isn't a huge amount of variation between interviews. Like if you're asking someone about baking, that's going to be a very different conversation than talking about video games. 2 very different things, not relating at all to like the interview thing, but it just like as an example to illustrate, if you're asking someone about baking and processes with baking, that's going to be a very different interview than asking someone, how do you make a video game? Right? And so you want to make sure that you are consistent with your questions for people who are applying for a similar position. In the process of hiring, direct supervisors should be able to determine who is the most qualified and best candidate for the position. But there are a couple of hazards that we should be careful of when we are hiring people. And I came up with a little mnemonic for it. It's HAIN. Not pain, but HAIN. Like HAIN. HAIN. Yeah? So HAIN stands for halo effect, attraction bias, impressive references, and nepotism. And we'll go through each of these. Halo effect is essentially that if you have the same background or similar interests, then you'll gravitate towards that person who is very similar, and you're like, wow, this person is like perfect because they're like me, and I like that, and I appreciate that. Attraction bias is like physical attractiveness, so if there's someone that you personally feel more attracted to, then you might potentially be more likely to put them in a position because of how they look, which is not ideal. You should not do that. Impressive references, if someone has like a 2-star reference on their resume versus someone who just has, not just, but has a teacher reference on their resume, then you may be like, oh, that 2-star is just super cool and super great, so I would rather pick the person with better connections. Should not just pick people based off of their connections. Sometimes the most qualified people don't have a reference at all listed, and they'll say references available upon request. And then nepotism, which is the last one, is like picking friends and family in professional matters. So, if you're the cadet commander, picking your best friend as the deputy commander without even considering other people, it's not the best look. You also want to have a good variety of perspectives too. So that's just something to keep in mind. And when it comes to like the end of employment somewhere, it is important to dismiss with dignity, which means don't just fire people. Like when I was talking about the example earlier with job descriptions and that like one squadron commander who just wasn't doing their job, we dismissed them with dignity. Like we didn't throw our hands up in the air and send out an email to the entire cadet staff saying, oh, this cadet just didn't do their job and so they're gone now. No, we just let them ride off into the sunset. It was fine. And we just kind of went separate ways. And if applicable, then the person should receive any pay. They should also be given prior notice. Like in that process that I was talking about, we didn't just fire them. We could have done that, but as a professional courtesy, we gave them a trial period. We talked them through our concerns. We laid out our expectations super clear. They didn't do it. And so they ended up parting ways with us. And that happens. Sometimes it won't be a perfect fit. Sometimes people will voluntarily step away from roles because they know they don't have the interest or they don't have the time. And it's important as a leader to do your best to facilitate and accommodate the members in your unit while also making sure that you're getting the mission done. And so I think that squadron commander example is a pretty good example of just highlighting, like, we were very patient with them. We treated them with respect. And at the end of the day, we saw that it wasn't working and they made the decision to leave. Next is the full range leadership model, which is a lot of information. And I'm going to throw as much as I can at you all at once and talk through each of these. What I found most useful when I was learning these was thinking of specific leadership examples that I had observed and specific people that I had observed when it came to each of those leadership styles. So I think as an exercise for you, I recommend putting out the full range leadership model. Like here I'm putting on the screen here. This is the full range leadership model, and I'm going to be going over it really briefly. And a recommendation that I have is that if there are people that you know of that fall into specific categories of the full range leadership model that you observed, for me, it was very useful for memorizing it because I would think, okay, this like individual consideration, this specific person, because I observed this thing. I remember specific examples. So if you remember specific examples, great. I'm not going to go into specific examples because they're my personal examples. But hopefully you can come up with examples from your leadership experience, whether that be at school, whether that be with work, whether that be with any organization you are in, whether that be Civil Air Patrol or outside of it. You should be able to come up with examples of each of these in the full range leadership model. And the mnemonic that I use to memorize the full range leadership model's like overall categories is absent, transactional, and transformational. And we'll go into each of the individual ones underneath those categories. So with the first one, under absent, there is laissez-faire, which is just the general absence of leadership, where there isn't really any guidance, it's just kind of nothing. Then under the transactional, there is management by exception and contingent reward. Management by exception is divided into active and passive. Passive is where the follower can just do what they're doing, and then when they mess up, the leader will step in, fix it, and then go back to not doing anything. And then the active is more like the leader will kind of be a bit more active, looking and checking for mistakes and then fixing them actively while stuff is going on. Then the contingent reward is by using incentives, you get people to do what you want. And so in a lot of people's jobs, contingent reward is where you make your money from your job by doing the work, and in exchange for doing the right thing, you get paid. It's as simple as that. So that is the transactional portion of the full range leadership model. Then within transformational leadership, under the full range leadership model, there is individual consideration, intellectual stimulation, inspirational motivation, and idealized influence. And within each of those, individual consideration is being one-on-one, being able to listen, coach, and help provide that member with the individual support. Intellectual stimulation is just to get people to think and really challenge them to go outside of what they normally do in order to be creative, come up with solutions, and be empowered to get the job done. Inspirational motivation is looking at confidence and really doing your best to increase the overall motivation in the team. And then idealized influence is modeling the positive behaviors that you would like to see your people do. And when you look at when each of these leadership techniques are being used, typically the tactical level employs transactional leadership, operational employs a mix of transactional and transformational, and then strategic level is primarily transformational leadership. Next is delegation, and it comes up with one of my favorite mnemonics to teach cadets how to delegate. And I have made a video on this, but it is something I will review in this one. It is called DAF, which is define, assign, authority, and follow up. When you have a task, you need to define what exactly that task entails. Because if you don't, then it's kind of difficult for people to know what's going on. And it should be a task that is routine, and it shouldn't be overly cumbersome or burdensome in any way. And it should also be beneficial to the subordinates receiving the task. When you assign it, you need to pick someone who is really right for the job. Sometimes it'll push them outside of their comfort zone, but you should be picking someone who it's appropriate for. For teaching a PT night, you may not pick a cadet airman to run PT because they've never done it before. They just don't have experience, and it can be very challenging. But you might have a senior NCO running PT, because while they have some experience with PT, they might not have experience extensively running PT, but they've experienced it before, and they can learn from other cadets, including yourself, on how things are run and feel empowered to get the task done. Then there's authority. When you give a task, you need to provide authority for them to accomplish it. What do they need to do that task successfully? When you give authority, which is the next A, you need to make sure that the person who has been given the task can do what they need to do to actually do it. Sometimes there have been instances where I've been asked, who gave you the authority to do that? And I ask myself, wait, you gave me this task. Didn't you give me the authority? There have been a couple of interesting instances where someone has actually asked me, who gave you the authority to do that? And it has always taken me aback, because the person who asked me who gave me the authority to do it is typically the person who gave me the task to begin with. And so it's very challenging for someone if you have not given them the authority. If someone needs to coordinate an activity, let's say you have tasked a cadet to put together plans to create an open house for your unit. And they're going to coordinate with all the teams for you. They're going to put together the floor plan and everything. They're going to send out emails. They're going to work with people. If you don't even give them the authority to coordinate with other people and say, hey, you can go email whoever you need to email to be successful with this task, then that can be a little challenging, because they may not know they have the authority and they won't do stuff, or they will do stuff that you don't want them to do. Like if it's a cadet, you may not necessarily want that cadet reaching out to a high level official at like a building that you want to use. You would probably need a senior member to coordinate certain things. So it's really good to define what they are allowed to do and what authority is associated with carrying out what you've asked them to do. Then following up. Following up is probably the most challenging thing, because if you don't follow up and something is just not getting done, you don't know why that person isn't getting the job done. We've gone over procrastination on the channel here. And people have their own reasons for procrastinating. But if you don't follow up, then you don't know. And as the leader, at the end of the day, it's your responsibility to make sure stuff is getting done. And so if you give someone a task and you give them 2 weeks to get that task done, it really doesn't hurt to check in at like 1 week and say, hey, how are things going? Because yes, you can expect people to have it done at the end of 2 weeks. Sometimes people have other priorities come up though. Maybe they have a test. Maybe they've got work. Who knows? But it's good to follow up to bring it back up on their radar and be like, hey, I know we had this thing that we discussed you doing. How's that going? And then if they need any help, then you can provide that help. You can provide that support and assistance so that they don't feel like they're just drowning out on their own. So there are a couple of potential problems that come up with delegation. One of which is just like you drop the task on the person. Sometimes it could be delegating the wrong thing. There can also sometimes be too much supervision, kind of like helicopter supervision, which can make it a little bit challenging. Sometimes it's unclear what the expectations are, or it's way too rushed. And then additionally, there's just sometimes picking the wrong person for the job. And then there's a couple of reasons why people fail to delegate. One of which is that they think it will take too much time for the task to be accomplished. Another of which is that they think there will be too many mistakes added to the equation if a subordinate does the task. There's also the idea that the commander might be shown up a little bit if a cadet who has been delegated a task exceeds the expectations. And there's also the concern of like losing touch with that job and not knowing exactly what's going on at all times. Next, I'm going to shift gears again on you. Next, we're going to talk about organizational culture. And organizational culture is the commonly held values within an organization of people. There are 3 different phases within the process of trying to instill organizational change, and that is unfreezing, learning new concepts, and actually implementing concepts. And with unfreezing, it's basically like making a widespread effort for people to feel like there needs to be a change and have motivation within the individuals and the organization as a whole in order to instill a change in the culture, like being more inclusive or trying to engage quieter members and get them super involved and excited about the program, bringing them out of their shells. With learning new concepts, there are things that organizations can do to help like facilitate people being more welcoming of change. So like providing psychological safety nets. So if people are like, oh no, this is new and scary, being like, that's okay. Coming up with like slogans and banners and helping communicate really transparently like what those new cultural norms are going to be like and get people thinking towards that mentality. And there's also like teachable moments where you can take a moment and be like, okay, so this is what happened, and then here is what we would like to do in the future. So as another example, I was doing a required staff training for encampment, and we had some difficulty at one point with cadets not having strong like sympathy and empathy with students, where they wouldn't necessarily approach the student in the most positive and productive way if they were homesick or if there was just like a situation going on in general. And so what I did was I created little scenario cards and I had like different roles where it was like it summarized the scenario on the top, and then it said what the person's role was. And we had senior members and cadets participating in this, where there were a couple of scenarios like a cadet sitting in the bathroom crying in one of the stalls because they were homesick. How would a cadet staff member approach that? Some cadet staff members used to think that it was appropriate to just run into the bathroom and start screaming at the cadet. And we wanted to make sure that they would not do that and provide them with the tools to be comfortable and confident in approaching said cadets with different tools in order to best handle that situation while not overwhelming the cadet who might have been homesick. And there were a couple of different situations where like cadets failed an inspection. How would you talk to them after that? Some cadets would be like, I will toss their bunks and do a hurricane inspection, which is not allowed. And I'm like, no, you're not doing that. What can you do to empower your people so that even though they may have failed an inspection, they will do better next time? They will be inspired and not scared. Because there's a difference between the being aggressive versus being assertive, which I will not discuss in this video, but utilizing appropriate tools in order to facilitate the best learning environment for students at encampment. So it was very challenging, but we ended up having a pretty good response to it across the board, where it was pretty good standardization of approaches. And yeah, everyone has their own individual differences, but everyone had the tools and they understood our expectations going into encampment and being able to be effective staff members. Then there's internalization of the culture change, which just means like your organization has like fully embodied it and now owns it. There are sometimes cases where people will not be on board. Like when I talked about that required staff training, some cadets weren't on board with it. They wanted to continue to do their own thing, and they were like, I'm going to use physical punishments. I will make the cadets do push-ups if they fail an inspection. And I'm like, how is that helping them? What is the intent? And we ended up almost sending a cadet staff member home because they weren't really aligned with the organization and just like completely going off on their own, doing their own thing. And I was like, this is not okay. We sat down with them. We talked it through. We came to a consensus of the approach moving forward. And as far as I know, nothing else happened. But still, in some cases, there is the nuclear option of firing people who refuse to change or they just cannot change. And there are challenges with organizational change sometimes where people will be adverse to it and they'll be like, I don't like the changes. And they'll always complain about it. And what's important is to maintain consistent messaging, maintain positive reinforcement of people who are instilling and embodying the values that you are looking for. And like that positive reinforcement is very important. And continuing to train and make sure that everyone understands what the expectations are, help to facilitate the culture that you are trying to instill. While it's important, I'm not going to talk super in depth about it, but the book also talks about how leadership should really focus in on safety and that everyone is responsible for it and that it is a value where you can incentivize people to think more safety-minded thinking through positive reinforcement and really actively educating and providing incentives when people understand and acknowledge what the expectations are regarding safety. And the last things I'm going to talk about here are the measurement tools for success. And that is looking at individual success in addition to measuring organizational level success. Individual success you can measure by objective and do management by objective to see if people are completing their tasks. And it's just like, are you checking off the tasks? It's not a great approach. It's just kind of like the boss checking off the boxes and being like, okay, did you do this? Did you not do this? Okay, good. And then that's it. Then there is 360-degree feedback, which is basically that everyone and anyone should be receiving feedback from anyone else in their chain. And so as a follower, you should be able to give feedback to your leader. If you are a cadet commander, then you should be able to receive feedback from like your deputy commander, maybe even your flight commanders. You should be able to receive feedback from your CDC as well, and be able to take all perspectives into account. However, there are some weaknesses to that where it does take more time. Sometimes it's very difficult to be consistent with it, and the boss is not necessarily in control of those discussions. It's more of a dialogue between parties who are involved and going over perspectives and feedback of areas for improvement and what is going well. And then with organizational performance, you're looking at objectives again, but you can look at like the overall objective, you can look at tasks associated with it, and you can look at action plans. It's a bit time consuming, and a lot of people are like, well, that's too much paperwork. And it is a lot of paperwork, but at the end of the day, it's also important to maintain accountability of the organization as a whole. And so you want to have specific metrics that you can measure to say, yes, the organization is meeting what it needs to be doing, in addition to maybe where it's not meeting what it needs to be doing. And like SUI, or the subordinate unit inspection, has specific standards that units are required to meet in order to be considered like meeting the expectations of a Civil Air Patrol unit. And as a cadet, you don't necessarily see that, but that's something as a senior member that we have to actively keep in mind. So that wraps up our chapter 11, folks. We did it. We made it to the end. It's one of the longest sets of notes that I have for Learn to Lead. It's actually 4 pages long of notes. So hopefully you enjoyed that, as we just kind of enjoyed the conversation talking about leadership and leadership as the commanders. So if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and that is all, folks. Until next time, toodles.